This video will cover very broadly the main events in George Orwell's 1984. The book is divided into 3 parts. In part 1, we meet Winston Smith, who is a lowly bureaucrat working for a government department called the Ministry of Truth. It's his job to rewrite history for the totalitarian government ruling what used to be called England, which is now part of a massive bloc called Oceania and has been renamed Airstrip 1. But Winston is unhappy. He doesn't like constantly having to rewrite history, and he doesn't like the idea that the truth will never be told because only the government's version of events is ever published. So he decides that he's going to write a secret diary to record his thoughts for future generations, to tell them the truth about this government. The problem is that, like everyone else, he is observed 24 hours a day. There are TV screens in every room where people can see what he's doing. They can hear what he's saying, and they can even hear him breathing and detect his heartbeat. And around London, posters reinforce the idea of total surveillance, reading "Big Brother is watching you." But when Winston takes a chance and writes the first date in his diary, April 4, 1984, he's not even sure it is 1984. And he has no way of double-checking because everything has been changed so often. And remember, this is someone who works for the government rewriting history. If he can't remember, who can? Now, another issue with this totalitarian society is that it's impossible to know who to trust. Anyone could be a spy of the thought police who literally police what people think. For example, at a daily event called the 2-Minute Hate, where citizens are encouraged to shout abuse at images of enemies of the state, he sees 2 people. One is a young woman, and one is a senior member of the governing party, O'Brien. He hates the young woman. This is because, although she's attractive, she's unattainable because she wears the red sash of the Junior Anti-Sex League. Emotional and sexual relationships are discouraged by the party. In addition, he hates young women because they are the most fanatical followers of government ideology. Now, in contrast, he feels drawn to O'Brien because he thinks somehow that O'Brien might share his hatred for the government. Now, note that he has no evidence to support either of these conclusions. But later he does recall a dream that he'd had 7 years earlier, in which he thought he heard O'Brien's voice saying, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." Perhaps this is what drew him towards O'Brien. Now, O'Brien belongs to the inner party, the top echelon of society, which holds all the power. And this is probably why O'Brien also appeals to Winston. He's a man with power who could possibly help overthrow the government. Winston himself belongs to the outer party. They're the next level down. They're the bureaucrats with no power and who will be fearful of losing their lives if seen to be disloyal. The final group in society, the proletariat or the PROLES, who are the biggest but poorest group with zero power. They comprise 85% of the population and they live in dire conditions. He thinks perhaps they could remember better times and could also be encouraged to overthrow the government. Sadly, that particular dream doesn't last very long. When he goes to talk with a member of the proletariat in a pub, he discovers that the old man cannot remember anything. His mind is like a rubbish tip. It's full of useless nonsense that can't possibly be used to convince anybody to overthrow the party. Downhearted, he leaves the pub, but then realises that he's outside the shop where he bought his diary, and when he goes in, another old prole, Mr. Charrington, shows him a bedroom with a picture of an old church called St. Clement Danes. But again, the only thing Charrington can remember about the church is the association with a nursery rhyme. However, nobody can remember all of the words, and this is another example of Proles having faulty memories. Now, when he leaves the shop, he's then horrified to see the young woman that he'd seen during the 2 minutes hate. He thinks she must be following him and will report him should he kill her. He decides not to, but he's terrified, and by the end of part 1 he feels very alone, but remembers the dream he'd had when he heard what he thought was O'Brien's voice saying, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." Perhaps, he thinks, there is some slight hope still. And when part 2 begins, there is hope. He sees the girl he thought was following him in the office, and as she passes him, she falls to the floor. As he helps her to her feet, she secretly slips a note into his hand, reading, "I love you." He hides the note because relationships between sexes, as we've heard, are discouraged by the party. He then meets her again in the cafeteria, and over the next few weeks they start a secret affair, and they even rent a room above Mr. Charrington's shop. Everything seems to be going along well, except it is clear that the young woman, whose name is Julia, has absolutely no interest in overthrowing the government. All she wants to do is to rebel by having a sexual relationship with Winston. But shortly after this he gets more good news. He meets O'Brien in a corridor at work, and O'Brien stops and commends Winston for his writing skills and then invites him to his home. And when Julia and Winston visit O'Brien, O'Brien does 2 things. He lists a number of crimes like killing and maiming, and he asks if they would be prepared to commit these crimes to overthrow the party. They say they will. He then says that in the near future a man will tap Winston on the shoulder and give him a copy of a book by someone called Emmanuel Goldstein. Goldstein is the traitor who betrayed the party. And so the book will describe how and why the party keeps control of the people. And as they prepare to leave, O'Brien then says they will meet again, and Winston replies, "In the place where there is no darkness." Winston then reads Goldstein's book in the room above Charrington's shop, and although he doesn't finish the book, when he hears a proletarian woman singing in the yard below, he becomes sure that Goldstein was going to go on to argue that the future lies with the Proles, and it is at this very moment that the police smash their way into the room, and Winston suddenly realises that Charrington was all along a member of the Thought Police. And so we move to part 3. Winston is taken to the Ministry of Love, which ironically is the place where the state tortures people and re-educates them. He watches other prisoners get beaten and taken away to somewhere called Room 101. And he also notices that the lights are never turned out, and realises that this is the place where there is no darkness. And then, through the door, comes O'Brien himself, accompanied by a member of the Thought Police. Winston cannot believe that O'Brien is also going to be tortured by the Thought Police. But of course, he's not. He's here to collect Winston so he can be re-educated. Winston is taken to a cell and is regularly beaten, tortured and electrocuted. And O'Brien says that the problem with Winston is that what he thinks he remembers is false, and says only what the party says is true. And then O'Brien holds up his hand and asks how many fingers, and when Winston answers 4, O'Brien gives him electric shocks until Winston says he can no longer tell how many fingers O'Brien is holding up, at which point O'Brien says that's better. Then O'Brien tells Winston why the party does all it can to stay in power, which is for power itself. He also says that the only freedom is serving the party. Anything else means you're not free. That's what the slogan "Freedom is Slavery" means. Only by becoming a slave to the party can Winston be truly free? And what if people don't want to give up their individual freedom? Then they must be made to do so by violence. Only making people continually suffer, perpetually, can you be certain that they will think what you want them to think. And that is why O'Brien says, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. But even after this torture, part of Winston still loves Julia, and that's why O'Brien finally takes him to room 101 and says, I shall save you. I shall make you perfect. But the means to do this is by making him face his greatest fear, rats. And at this point, Winston's head is put into a cage with rats just the other side of a partition, so that when the partition is raised, the rats will run in and eat their way through his face. As O'Brien says, when even pain is not enough, people must be made to face what they think is unendurable. And at this point, Winston is finally broken and screams at O'Brien to put Julia in his place. His ultimate fear has driven him to renounce his love for Julia. He's betrayed her, and there is no going back. So Winston is released, and in fact meets Julia, but they're broken people. All of the human affection between them has been burnt out. As Winston realises, Julia had thought that the party couldn't get inside you. She was wrong. They could. So now Winston sits waiting for the day that the party will kill him. But he doesn't care, because as the final words of the book say, he's happy. He realises that he was in error, wanting freedom and wanting to overthrow the party. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. So I hope that this short video has given you some useful insights and that it will help you to get greater enjoyment from George Orwell's 1984. Give a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video and subscribe now so that you don't miss any of my future posts.